Greetings and salutations, fellow book readers. This is Mark, and the book I will review today is On a Chinese Screen. Before we continue, this is personalized limited edition of On a Chinese Screen with leather cover designed and made by me. At the end of the video, I will tell you a couple of ways of how you can get one for yourself, if you are interested. Now let's get back to the review. On a Chinese Screen is a travel book by Somerset Maugham, published in 1922. Maugham was one of the most popular writers of his time, and over a long career that spanned more than 60 years, he wrote many novels, plays, short stories, and travel memoirs, many of them adapted into films. Maugham stems from the great tradition of the English writers and is one of the pioneers of the 20th century British literature, with its gift of keen observation and beautiful English prose. And for me, he's up there with Graham Greene, V.S. Pritchett, and George Orwell as the modern British literary icon. What is On a Chinese Screen about? It is about Maugham's 1920 trip to China, where he follows the Yangtze River and describes scenery, local traditions, and the somewhat eccentric individuals he meets along the way. It is traveling the old way when it was difficult, and because of it, it was special and appreciated. Most of the time you would be the only stranger visible, and the locals kept a respectful distance. Nowadays you hop a plane, and in a few hours you find yourself on the other side of the world, surrounded by other loud, annoying tourists and locals constantly trying to sell you something. And that's why I don't travel much. I find reading about it more enjoyable. A bit of the plot. The plot of the book is a collection of short stories, 58 in total. Each one focuses on the place visited or the individual met. I will mention a few stories to give you a general idea of the book's sub-themes. Maugham begins with the story appropriately titled The Rising of the Curtain, where he describes your early 20th century common Chinese town. Then there is one called Mongol Chief, which talks about caravans of camels circulating between Siberia and Beijing, and the title character remembers with some nostalgia his great ancestors who rode on the plains of China, where many rich cities laid ready for looting. The cabinet minister is about a Chinese public servant complaining and blaming younger generation for declining of the Chinese values and westernization of the country, while he himself, through his own actions and oblivious of his doings, greatly contributes to the very problem he is grumbling about. The Servants of God is a conversation between two missionaries, the French and the English one, about their life in China and how they came to live there. Somewhat personal description of the men who traveled to the earth's ends to baptize savages. The Opium Den is a description of a homely, cozy, and cheerful spot where men come to relax and forget, and it reminds the writer of a Berlin beer hall which served the very same purpose. The Point of Honor is a bit off topic when the writer, somewhat unusually for the English, defends the French nation. Nothing hinders friendly relations between different countries so much as the fantastic notion which they cherish about one's and other characteristics, and perhaps no nation has suffered so much from the misconception of its neighbors as the French. They have been considered a frivolous race, incapable of profound thought, flippant, immoral, and unreliable. Even the virtues that have been allowed them, their brilliancy, their gaiety, have been allowed them, at least by the English, in a patronizing way. I see the French suffering a bit from an inferiority complex spurred by their contact with the Germanic people. They were invaded by the English, beaten by the Germans, and rescued by the Americans. And yet they are a great nation with, surprisingly to many, more victories on the battlefield than any other. and incalculable contributions to the Western civilization. The Beast of Burden describes a Chinese coolie and his brutal and animal-like existence, the sad life of physical suffering brought on by an unpassionate social system. To be harassed by the wear and tear of life, and to pass rapidly through it without the possibility of arresting one's course, is not this pitiful indeed? To labor without ceasing, and then, without leaving to enjoy the fruit, worn out, to depart suddenly, one knows not whither, is not that just a cause for grief? The grand style is about a very old man who came to China 6 decades ago and is ready to retire, but he won't go back home to England. He has not been there for 30 years, and what he heard was that nowadays England was no place for a gentleman. Perhaps this is Maugham metaphor for not being able to go back in life, since it is always changing and moving forward, and what we left behind is gone. The rain is about the misery of traveling during cold and rainy days with nothing to look forward to but the discomfort of the Chinese inn. And once there, all you can think about is the comfortable life you had back home in London. The feeling of there is no place like home, but only felt when you are away from it. The Song of the River describes the hard and cruel life on the river, again the adversity of being a Chinese coolie, their somber singing as the only testament of their hopeless struggle. The sweat pours down their faces, and their song is a groan of pain. It is a sigh of despair. It is heart-rending. It is hardly human. It is the cry of souls in infinite distress, only just musical, and the last note is the ultimate sob of humanity. Life is too hard, too cruel, and this is the final despairing protest. That is the Song of the River. Mirage is a portrayal of your somewhat typical American who lives simply and somewhat isolated, oblivious and ignorant of his surroundings, an ancestor of the proverbial ugly American. He has lived in China for 5 years, but knows no Chinese, and takes no interest in the race among whom, in all likelihood, the best years of his life will be spent. In Democracy, Mon sees and presents China as socially more democratic than Europe or America, because their democracy is a product of their customs and traditions and not some political illusion. The philosopher whom Mon meets and finds full of contradictions is an example of the so common self-proclaimed philosophers, full of self-importance and, erroneously, self-assured to have the answers. The side of the town touches on the brutality of China's tradition of infanticide. I found this to be the saddest of all the stories. It shows the human coldness and lack of compassion through the treatment of the most vulnerable and innocent. Mon has a conversation with a Spanish nun in an orphanage about her efforts to try to save the infants. You see, she explained, they have often a long walk to come here, and unless we give them something, they won't take the trouble. In The Normal Man, Mon discusses, through the examples of people he met, the rarity of the so-called normal man, since in reality each one of us carries a few hidden idiosyncrasies. You see, the normal is the rarest thing in the world. The Taipan, which used to mean a foreign businessman in China, the number one, is about an English official who came to the country 30 years ago and had no intention of ever going back. But then he realizes that deep inside he really hates China and the Chinese and needs to get out as soon as possible. The fragment deals with Chinese aesthetics and their need for decorating, the Oriental obsession with details, and how this exaggeration can become overwhelming and weary for the Westerner. But also Mon shows his appreciation for the Chinese artistry. The question talks about Chinese religious reasoning, and the final story, A Libation to the Gods, further describes Chinese spirituality. And there are many more stories, that form some idea about China of the early 20th century. What are my thoughts about On a Chinese Screen? I like Bond's unique approach to writing travel books, since he wasn't a travel writer but a novelist, and his style was somewhat atypical for the genre. He turns his trip into a short story collection, and instead of creating fiction, he transforms observations into stories. So the book reads more as a short story collection than a travelogue. It makes the reading more enjoyable and smoother. Actually, sometimes you have to remind yourself that you are reading non-fiction. What makes Mon travel writing distinct is that he's more interested in people than sites, so his descriptions are more cultural, immaterial, and psychological than physical. And he presents the characters in detailed and colorful depictions, such as his air of dignity was heightened by three massive chins. He had a big trunk and an imposing corpulence, so that when he sat at table, he sat a little away from it, as though he ate under protest. On a Chinese Screen, Mon focuses on the foreigners, such as diplomats, missionaries, businessmen, and general vagabonds that live in China. Their somewhat colorful and adventurous existence, and also the difficulty and unwillingness to integrate, and the effects this has on their lives and personalities. There are some descriptions of the locals, but they are limited and somewhat superficial. It was probably caused by the language barrier, since Mon didn't speak Chinese, and there weren't many Chinese he met along the way who spoke English. And I think this hindered any effort to get a deeper sense of who they were as individuals. Interestingly, many of the characters mentioned in the book planned on staying in China long term and even retiring there, because they didn't have any idea of how many changes would transpire in the country over the next 30 years and all the suffering and violence this would create. Unawarely, they were witnessing the end of the old China and the dawn of the new struggle for control between the nationalists and the communists. Of course, all the expats could, and many did, somewhat safely retire in Hong Kong or Macau, since both places would remain in the hands of the Europeans until the end of the 20th century, except for the few short years of Japanese occupation during World War II. Actually, Macau was never occupied, since Portugal was a neutral country during the war, and surprisingly, the Japanese respected it. I think it probably was more useful as a neutral port, similar to the Germans preferring and benefiting more from neutral Switzerland than it being a part of their dominion. To sum it up, On a Chinese Screen is typical Mon when traveling, focusing on the unique, extraordinary, and out of its place. And through the small bits, he forms a somewhat comprehensible picture of the place. Mon injects, in his English style, a lot of his personal form into the stories, and there's plenty of sarcasm, humorous conclusions, and occasional mocking, and the characters range from comic to tragic. In general, there are some great descriptions and general opinions of the Westerners living in the Far East at the beginning of the 20th century, and all of it is relayed to the reader in a beautiful and occasionally poetic prose. The book is kind of a snapshot of early 20th century China and limited to that period of time. It portrays China that no longer exists, except for the books and photos, insecure, humble, and submissive. It is a great contrast to the China of today, confident with unlimited ambitions and set on dominating the world. But the foreigners Mon meets there are not that different from some of the expats I met while living in Brazil in the early 21st century. The circumstances and surroundings change, but people not so much. The stories themselves are only connected by the place, China, so they could be read in any order. I think Mon mentioned that the stories were not a book, but material for a book. They might have served as a reference for the painted viol he wrote a few years later. There is a story of a doctor who has been in China for a few decades a man on whom the wife cheated, and also some descriptions of bored and dissatisfied women. And all of these circumstances are presented in the latter book. Also, some stories and the characters might be found in other collections of Maugham's writings, so if you read other works by Maugham and some stories sound familiar to you, this might be the reason. Okay, let's talk about the physical book. The book I am holding is a paper bag which I transformed into a hardcover leather-bound edition. To make the cover, I use grade A naturally tan hide I buy from a tannery in North Spain. It is the same leather Louis Vuitton uses to make his bags, so this top quality. I do all the processing of the leather myself. First, I designed the cover, and what I did here, I found this vintage travel to the Orient poster with some Chinese buildings and bridges and a couple of junk boats, and I thought it nicely represented the theme of the book. This is the back with the blurb, and inside front cover I printed a quote from the book. If you want to see a more detailed video where I explain how I transform paper bag into leather hardcover, click on the link in the description. I will make a maximum of 100 editions of each title. Each one will be numbered and initialed, and the numbers will go in chronological order from 2 up, since number 1 stays with me. The price will be around $100, so if you would like me to make one for you, you can click below on my email and send me a message. I do not guarantee I will do it, since it will depend on the time I have available, access to leather, and if I can get my hands on the copy of the book. Now, if you're not willing to spend the $100, but you still want the book, what you can do is click below on the PayPal link and donate $3 or more to my channel, and for every 100 donations, I will make a lottery and draw one name, and the winner will receive the book. So, if you're cheap but feel lucky, this might be the way to do it. Also, your donations give me the extra motivation to make the book reviews, and I appreciate them very much, so thank you in advance. One more thing, when you make your donation, remember to include the title of the book you would like to win. The book itself is beautiful. Visually, it has a very nice texture, it smells great, and the more you handle it, the more beautiful it will become. And it makes a great gift for yourself or somebody who appreciates books. So, if you want one, don't snooze, or you might lose. Well, that's it, so let's end it here, and until next time, keep your ear close to the ground and read a book. Adios.